Welcome everyone, it's the final day of Young Writers Week, and here we're going to talk about the last of our non-standard storytelling mediums, stand-up comedy. Now, of all of the media I've talked about this week, stand-up comedy is likely the oldest, though it's difficult to trace exactly how old it is. The earliest instances of stand-up comedy and things like it appear in China at least 200 years ago, known as Xiansheng, but it's difficult to know if Western stand-up is derived from that form. American stand-up first started appearing just over 100 years ago as part of variety sideshow acts like vaudeville or burlesque shows, which when you think about it explains why modern stand-up retains some of this tendency towards raunchy and off-the-cuff humor. That being said, it also remains a very difficult medium to write for. It is, in essence, just a person standing in front of an audience trying to make them laugh. And if this sounds terrifying to you, that's because it kinda is. Fear of public speaking remains the most common phobia in the world because you have to talk to people. Stand-up comedy is a very honest and personal medium, sharing a lot in common with poetry actually, as it's usually about a single performer talking about things that they think about, the events in their life, and how and why they're important to the audience. Only in poetry, the point is to make a grand expression about the state of the world, and in comedy, the point is to make people laugh. Though you may also make grand points about the state of the world, it's just hidden under satire or a veil of humor. In fact, the performances of both stand-up comedy and poetry are about eliciting a specific emotional response from the audience by performing what is essentially an extended monologue. Each of them requires a lot of thought about specifically how things are said, how ideas are structured and connected to each other, and often involve a lot of practice in order to understand what works, what people receive, and what they don't react to. Puns are like the middle ground for this. It's a combination of wordplay and making fun of the way things sound. Stand-up comedy is a form that is probably most similar to some of our ancient forms of comedy that involved one person standing on stage telling a story. Some of our most ancient stories, such as those collected in the Odyssey or the Iliad, are essentially a collection of the stories told by traveling bards and storytellers who would go around talking and reciting stories that they had memorized. As I mentioned before, this is performance at its most raw. There's no supporting actors, there's no stage directors, there's no music, there's no support. It's just you telling a story to a bunch of people. And so hopefully this will help you tell some of those stories if you choose to go into it. Now, the first and most obvious limitation to the medium is that it's called stand-up comedy. The point is to make people laugh. Regardless of what you're trying to do with the medium, the end goal is to make people laugh. And so the kind of stories you're able to tell will be a little bit limited by the fact that are they funny enough to work for a stand-up comedy routine. But in many cases, developing stories for the medium is simply about the way you view events in your life, the lens through which you explain the things that have happened. Because most things can be viewed in a comedic lens and can be communicated in a way that is funny. The second limitation is that you don't exactly have a lot of support either on or off the stage. You are primarily responsible for developing the jokes, figuring out a narrative with which to deliver all those jokes, and then to go on stage and deliver all of those jokes. Although it's possible for you to create duo or even trio acts, it still means that you, as a group, are responsible for the entirety of the performance. Those limitations shouldn't be all that surprising. It's, after all, called stand-up comedy, so you have to just stand up and tell comedy. But there's a lot of extraordinary benefits when it comes to telling stories through it. The first is that the audience will give you a lot of leeway in their suspension of disbelief. It is very much possible for you to just dress up as King Henry VIII and address the audience as King Henry VIII and tell an extended joke about the history of England at his time and being generally uncool to the people you're married to. Whereas in a play you have to be very precise and accurate in your representations in order for the audience to buy into the fact that this is supposed to be Henry VIII. As a comic, they will buy into it even if you just put on a funny face and a silly hat and say, "I'm King Henry VIII." That's all it takes. Really. Stand-up comic audiences are pretty lax about that kind of stuff. The second benefit to storytelling in stand-up comedy isn't exactly an advantage to stand-up comedy specifically, but rather to comedic works as a whole. It relies around the idea that people will more quickly become attached to characters when they're funny than they are when they're serious. You see this a lot in other media where people's favorite characters tend to be comic relief characters or people who just make a goof of themselves more often than not. Because these characters make them laugh, the audience has a much higher opinion of them and feels and pays a lot more attention to their antics. As a comic, it's very important to take advantage of this because once you get the audience laughing and invested in the funny parts of your story, you can transition to more serious and honest parts of it. And if you watch stand-up comedy, you can actually see the better comics do this. After an extremely funny story, they'll usually pull it back by getting serious and open about some of their fears or some of their more vulnerable aspects in order to rebalance the mood at the same time that they create a more strong connection between themselves and the audience. I should clarify that when I say stories, I don't mean fiction necessarily. Non-fiction requires extraordinary amount of storytelling to get the point across as well. This is essential to the way you weave stories together, even outside of comedy. Understanding emotional exhaustion is essential to telling any story, because there has to be a variety of expressions, a variety of emotions that any story has to tell. Because you can't be laughing for an hour straight. You can't be crying for an hour straight. But if you make someone laugh for a while and then cry and then laugh again, you've told a much strong story than if you just did one of those things for the entire hour. Well, try to do one of those things. It's very difficult to make people laugh for an hour straight. And finally, how do you break into stand-up comedy? Well, like poetry, stand-up comedy tends to have a lot of amateur nights or places where you can, as someone with no experience, go and find an audience who will listen to your performances. Of course, I would recommend going to one of these amateur nights before attempting to perform at one so that you have a better understanding of what caliber of comedy is expected from you. Because you can't compare your first performance to professional stand-up comedy, because that's professional stand-up comedy. It's the best of the best, and you can't expect your first performance to be anywhere near there. Even professional comics sometimes go to these amateur nights just to polish out which parts of their performance are gold and which of them are significantly less gold. Then, as you gain more experience as a stand-up comic and your material becomes more and more refined, you'll often find you'll gain a small following of people who respect your abilities as a performer, and you'll start getting invited to perform at places. You're probably not going to get paid, but you'll be invited to be a guest of honor, which is a small step up fame-wise. And that small following will be the groundwork for you to develop greater followings and eventually find ways to put on shows that will actually support you. I'm not sure exactly how you're supposed to do that, but I don't think anyone actually does. And so with that, we've come to the end of our description of stand-up comedy and of our description of non-standard storytelling mediums as a whole. I hope you enjoyed following me for all this week, and if you have questions that I wasn't able to answer, make sure to drop by the Ask an Expert panel tomorrow between noon and 4 p.m. Today I'll be introducing the panelist Roxanne Felix Ma. Roxanne is one of the authors of The Woman of the Apocalypse, a collaborative anthology of 4 speculative fiction novellas which won the Aurora Award for Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy for Best Work in English in 2009. If you have any questions for her or any of the other panelists, make sure to drop by tomorrow. I hope to see you there. Until then, have a great night and keep on writing. You have to talk to people. See, it's easy for me because it's like a webcam. So I get to make a lot of mistakes over and over and over again and then edit them out. So I made a mistake trying to talk to the webcam about not being able to speak a full sentence without studying.